Hey, it's Ezekiel here, and today's walking tour is at Kirkham Priory in North Yorkshire. The Augustan Priory was established in 1122 by Walter Elsbeck. Over the years the priory prospered until the canons were strongly influenced by the Cistercians at Revel, and between 1135 and 1139 attempts were made to convert Kirkham into a Cistercian abbey. In 1155 Walter died and the estate passed through his sisters to the de Roos, who became the new lords of Helmsley and patrons of the priory. By 1535 King Henry VIII closed down monasteries and Kirkham was assessed to have a net income of £269, 5 shillings and 9 pence. And in December 1538 the priory was stripped of all valuables, and over the years the buildings decayed. In the 1920s to 1930s, Kirkham was owned by the Crown and a busy tourist attraction, which is now managed by English Heritage. Kirkham Priory is picturesquely sited on a slope of the east bank of the River Derwent. This situation restricted the development of the buildings, some of which had to be terraced into the hillside. The site is entered through a splendid gatehouse of late 13th or early 14th century date. It is flanked by a porter's lodge and other chambers which may have served as guest houses or the site of the priory courthouse. Between the gatehouse and the church there is a large open area of grass, which was formerly the outer court. Kirkham was established in around 1122 on a site which almost certainly had an existing church, dating from the late Saxon period. The use of existing religious sites for new monastic foundations seemed to have been common in this area, and indicates that the introduction of the Augustans was seen at the time as a reform of the existing religious structures in Yorkshire. The reforms were actively prompted by the Archbishop of York. The founder of Kirkham was Walter Elsbeck, who had recently been given lands by the king. The first prior was William, rector of Garton, and the founder's uncle. He was also a canon of Nystelle, which suggests that Nystelle Priory was the founding house. The priory prospered and was probably soon able to start building in stone. However, the attention of its patron, Walter Elsbeck, soon became drawn to the other great contemporary reforming religious movements, the Cistercians, and in 1131 he established a new house of that order at Revel, much closer than Kirkham to the castle at Helmsley. This is the west end of the church and the vaulted outer parlour. Soon after 1132, Waltheof, stepson of King David of Scotland and a friend of Walter Elsbeck, became Kirkham's third prior. Waltheof and some of his canons became strongly influenced by the Cistercians of Revel, and between 1135 and 1139 an attempt was made, probably by Elsbeck, to convert Kirkham to a Cistercian house. Unfortunately, This seems to have split the community at Kirkham, as some of the canons did not agree with the proposal. Following their closure, some abbeys and priories were simply demolished for their stone, but others eventually found other uses. In the 18th and 19th centuries, some like Revel Abbey was incorporated and designed gardens and landscapes. Kirkham Priory found an unusual use in more recent times. During World War II, Kirkham and other places in Yorkshire were used by the military in training for D-Day, the Normandy landings. Tanks and other military vehicles had to disembark from landing craft, and so a large pool was created between the Priory and the river to test their waterproofing. The high wall of the Western Cloister Range behind us was also used to train troops in the use of scrambling nets for transferring from the main transport ships into smaller landing craft. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, took a keen interest in the training and is known to have visited Kirkham to inspect the preparation. These events of recent history show unsuspected use of our historic monuments. This is the remains of the main kitchen, which was a square building with traces of a central hearth and an oven in the south wall. Attached to its south side is another building which may have formed lodgings for some of the priory servants, such as cooks. An agreement survives, by which these canons were to be relocated to a new site at Linton-on-Ouse, where they were to be provided with new buildings, comparable to those existing at Kirkham. They were to take with them all the coloured glass from the windows, as well as vestments, plates, utensils and books, leaving in place simple plain glass and a single bell. In the event the agreement fell through, and the canons remained at Kirkham. Walthoff seems to have been slow in deciding whether to join the Cistercians or not, for he led a new Augustan settlement to Thornton in North Lincolnshire in 1139 and only returned to Kirkham at the canon's request. Eventually he left Kirkham to join the Cistercians and became abbot of Warden, Revel's daughter house, and subsequently of Melrose in Scotland, which had been founded by his stepfather. His reputation and sanctuary was such that he was eventually recognised as a saint, and his tomb in the chapter house of Melrose became an object of pilgrimage. The latrine was attached to the canon's dormitory, with the seats on the floor above. In its basement is a great stone lined drain which was flushed by running water to carry away the waste. This drain starts high up in the hillside and runs in a long curving arc, serving a series of buildings along its way, including the infirmary hall. The division within the community at Kirkham was not without compensation, for it prompted Elspeth to issue a second foundation charter, which confirmed and added substantially to his early endowments. Despite the charter evidence, it seems clear that there was little animosity between the two monasteries, and in 1141 the Kirkham community joined ranks with those at Revel to dispute the election of William Fitzherbert as Archbishop of York. Just before his death in 1155, Elspeth joined the Cistercians at Revel, where he was buried. His estate passed through his sisters to the de la Rues, who became the new lords of Helmsley and patrons of the Priory. The house seems to have prospered for most of the 12th century, a period which saw substantial rebuilding of the church. In the 13th century, the Priory of Kirkham became the burial chamber of the family, many of the de Rues lords being buried in the area surrounding the high altar. The church was massively enlarged by the addition of a magnificent new Priory, and it seems that this grand rebuilding was intended to encompass the whole church and other parts of the Priory buildings. Eventually, however, the scheme was abandoned, and the turbulent years at the start of the 14th century meant that it was never resurrected. Life at the Priory followed a regular routine of 7 services a day, with additional services on feast days and at great festivals of Easter and Christmas. The church was provided with many altars, at which the canons celebrated Mass. The daily routine was not quite as rigorous as those of the Cistercians or Benedictines, and some of the canons were expected to serve as priests at churches held by the Priory. These canons thus obtained a break from the monotony of monastic life, though the majority of the churches held by the Priory was served by vicars in return for a regular fee. This was an advantage to the Priory, who took the surplus income for itself. In 1291, around 2/3 of the Priory income was derived from churches. This corner of the site contains a straggling range of domestic buildings constructed on a series of man-made terraces. In order to provide them with latrines, they were built along the line of the Priory main drain that runs in a curving line down the hillside. The Prior's residence is on the right, with an external stair leading to the first floor entrance. As head of the house, the Prior could expect to live in some comfort in his own apartment. This self-contained range formed a complex series of rooms that would have included a hall, kitchen, study, private bedchamber, chapel and servants' quarters. The building with the large window immediately to the left of the Prior's residence may have included a misericord or refectory where meat could be eaten. To the left of the misericord is the large 13th century infirmary hall where canons who were sick or infirm were accommodated. Periodically, all the canons were bled for health reasons and spent several days in the infirmary, where they enjoyed a better diet and rest before returning to life in the cloister. In the 14th century, some of the priors retired to live a life of ease in a house adjoining this infirmary. They were provided with a pension, food, servants, a garden and their own horses. The cloister was a square court with covered alleys on each side and was used by the canons for study and writing. The cloister alley roofs were probably supported on arches, carried on twin shafts, but all traces of them have now disappeared. In the opposite corner of the cloister are the remains of the laver, which was built in the late 13th century. The laver has two arched recesses that are decorated with geometric tracery panelling on the rear wall and retain faint traces of painted figures. This was where the canons washed their hands before entering the refectory through the elaborate 12th century doorway on the left. The laver had a piped water supply with taps that were probably set over a lead or pewter washing trough. In the corner, a circular stairs led down to a vaulted undercroft beneath the refectory. In the 19th century, the cloister was used as a tennis court, and wooden benches were set within the arches of the laver. By the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s, this income balance had changed to around half from each source. As an institution, the prior had many rights and privileges, which it was quick to defend if it was thought the infringements had occurred. This could extend to taking legal action against patrons, as demonstrated by a case brought in the King's Court in 1257 against William de Roos. His son William was sued in 1261 over hunting rights in Helmsley Wood and Moor. It seems clear that he had been trying to alienate rights granted to the Priory by Walter Elspeth 130 years before. The Priory won each case, and it cost the de Roos additional lands and privileges to settle the matter. Despite these legal wrangles, William was still allowed to be buried before the high altar of the Priory church. The church was the most important building of the Priory and was rebuilt in the late 12th century. It was further extended in the 13th century with the addition of a large probestery. Piers for a new crossing tower had been built, but financial difficulties meant the scheme was abandoned. The existing crossing tower was retained and the new probestery simply butted up to its eastern side. The choir stalls were moved into the new probestery, where the canons assembled for their services. The new probestery ranked in size and splendour with others in the area such as Reval Abbey and Whitby Abbey, and was therefore one of the most impressive in the north of England. The walls were limewashed and painted with a red masonry pattern, with other details such as capitals and mouldings also highlighted in red. In the east wall, there was a circular or rose window, similar to the rose window in York Minster. In the middle of the 13th century, the area around the high altar in the Priory became the burial place of the de Roos, Lord of Helmsley, who was the main patron of the priory. A local tradition suggests that after the closure of the priory, much of its high-quality stone was taken away to build Howsham Hall, 2 miles from the priory. This is the remains of a tall window at the east end of the church. Though it was an independent priory, Kirkham was subject to the discipline of the Archbishops of York, and their visitation registers show how the priory was plunged into serious debt. In 1280 the finances were in order, but in 1314 there were some deficiencies in the chapter house, dormitory and infirmary, which required repair, and they were heavily in debt. In 1321, John de Yarm was elected prior, and the Archbishop noted the debts now totalled £843, 15 shillings and 9 pence. An explanation shows that the bulk of the debt had accumulated through non-payment of rents since 1314 from the prior's Northumberland estates, valued at 1,000 marks, which is equivalent to £670 per year. Presumably, these estates had largely been lost or laid waste during the war between Edward II and Robert the Bruce, which culminated in the Scottish victory at Bannockburn. To help pay off the debt, the prior had resorted to selling corrodies, a form of medieval pension scheme. The refectory also stood on vaulted undercroft, supported on a central row of piers, traces of which we can still see in front of us. This side of the refectory doorway dates from the 13th century. Many of the de Roos lords were buried here in this area surrounding the high altar. By 1535, King Henry VIII had established himself as head of the English Church and ordered a survey in which Kirkham was assessed as having a net annual income of £269, 5 shillings and 9 pence. Henry then decided to close down all the monasteries with an annual value of less than £200, and in the process gain all their income and property for himself. Kirkham thus escaped the first round of the monastic closures in 1536. The original small church was rebuilt in the late 12th century to a larger scale, with a central and western tower. The main entrance doorway was in the north wall of the nave, which was used for some time as a local parish church. The parishioners had responsibility for the upkeep of the bells and bell ropes in the western tower. In the 13th century, a vast new presbytery was added at the east end as part of a scheme to rebuild the whole church for the second time. However, in the early 14th century, the priory had financial problems and the rebuilding was abandoned. This left the church with a huge new eastern section that was significantly higher than the nave and transepts to which it was attached. In the 14th and 15th centuries, vestries and chapels were built as modest additions to the north transept and probestery. The area in front of this panel, between the church and the gatehouse, formed the outer court of the priory. It contained a number of buildings, such as the guest house, guest hall and stables. The gatehouse formed the main entrance into the priory and was built around 1320 to 1340. It has a wide carriage arch, surmounted by a very decorative pointed gable, around which is arranged a series of shields bearing the arms of noble patrons with which the priory was associated. These include those of the main patrons, the de Roos family. The shields are made to look as if they're hanging on hooks fastened to the wall. The upper part of the wall is divided into 5 bays. Within these are statue niches, or windows. The central bay has 3 niches for statues, with a figure of Christ in majesty in the centre. The window divisions or tracery form pointed star shapes. This design is known as Kentish style and also occurs in the north wall of the church at Whitby Abbey. Flanking the entrance arch on the south side is a buttress which has a fine ornamented pinnacle. This was one of a pair, but the corresponding northern buttress has been lost. The display of heraldry reflects a new fashion of the time for architectural work to display the arms of the patrons associated with the institution. While acting as a decorative scheme, it is also clearly declared to the outside world the association of the priory with rich and powerful families to whom it might turn into times of trouble. The gate passage was stone vaulted in 2 bays, with the gates on the inner arch. On either side of the gatehouse and continued into a chamber over the gate passage was a series of ground and first floor rooms, thought to have served as accommodation for guests. Each room was provided with a fireplace and separate latrine. Let's take to the sky with Jack. Thanks all for watching, do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.